Welcome to the Berkshires Gone By, history and folklore about the westernmost and most beautiful county in Massachusetts. I'm your host, Brooke. This is the second part of a two-parter, though you need not listen to them in order. Our last was about the trial of John Ten Eyck after the murder of the Stillmans of Sheffield. During this episode, I will read what he called his sketch, the story of his life, which he penned while waiting in prison for that trial. You'll notice some key differences in the story he tells here and what was reportedly dug up during that trial. And it is some of these differences that make ascertaining his guilt now such a puzzle. So without any further ado, here is the life of John Ten Eyck. The life of John Ten Eyck, written by himself while in prison awaiting trial for the murder of Mr. and Mrs. David Stillman of Sheffield, Massachusetts. Published by David O'Connell, Pittsfield, Massachusetts, Sun Book and Job Printing Rooms, 10.5 North Street, 1878. Preface. It is not my object in giving this sketch of my life to the public to do it for gain nor for fame. But as I have been arrested and imprisoned on a charge of murder, and am innocent, and seeing that some of the county papers have indulged in so many false reports, yes, base lies, about me, few of which I intend to put into my sketch, I feel it my duty to show the world how an innocent man may be slandered, and perhaps tried, and convicted, condemned, perhaps executed, through prejudice grown out of false reports, and without the slightest foundation. I mean to make a truthful statement in my sketch, and also to request those whom it may reach, who know me, to confirm my statements by publication in one of the Pittsfield papers, as I shall make arrangements with the editor to insert all such communications, or any other that he receives fully signed. Also, any contradictions of my statement, with particulars also fully signed. I propose to give the sketch, to show first my birthplace, school days, places of residence, and different towns and acquaintances. Also to show how a man may suffer, even undeservedly, and no doubt many who have known me will read it with sadness, and see what a sad wrong I have undergone and suffered. John Ten Eyck. I was born in the town of Lenox, Berkshire County, state of Massachusetts, in the North District of the town, 2 miles north of Lenox and 4 miles south of Pittsfield. The house stood at a crossroad, going west from Walter Richards, 1/2 mile on the road toward Samuel Belden Farm, or then Colonel Levi Belden's, the father of Samuel Belden. My mother's name was Orilla Maria Fletcher, and my father's name was John Ten Eyck. He had formerly been a slave in the state of New York, and ran away, and came to Lenox, where he went to work for Judge Walker, and worked a number of years, during which time he formed an acquaintance with my mother. By him she had 2 children, both boys, one older than I, 2 years and 7 months. His name is William Henry Ten Eyck. My father never kept house with my mother, but had her boarded where I was born. The name of the people where I was born, and lived with for some years, were Joseph and Nancy Kelson, perhaps one of the most respectable colored couples ever known in the county. They had a small place of 3 acres of land, and kept a cow, and were hard workers and good livers. My mother, brother, and I lived with them until I was 13 months old, and he, my brother, was then 3 years and 8 months old. Previous to this time, some 2 months, my father had run away, and left my mother and us 2 children. So my mother, being discouraged, and knowing that we had a better home than she could give us, consulted Nancy Kelson, who had become greatly attached to both of us children. It was agreed that my mother should go off and leave us with her on this condition, that my mother should never come and take us away from her. Now, Joseph and Nancy had kept the poor of the town of Lenox previous to this and afterwards, over 30 years in all. So she applied to the town for our support, and received a slight sum for that purpose until I had got to be 5, and my brother 7 years and 7 months old. The selectmen proposed to put us out until we were 21 years of age to some good farmers, but Nancy, rather than part with us, took us off of the town as hers, and commenced sending us to school the same spring. I shall here state some changes that took place in the course of this year, merely to show those who were our neighbors, and what a memory I have now at the age of 46. The schoolhouse where I went to school stood on a crossroad, 1/2 mile north of the one on which I lived, and to go to school it was nearer for my brother and I to go across the lots, so that we did not have to go more than 2/3 of a mile to get there. My first teacher's name was R. Angeline Case, from Blandford, Massachusetts. I went to school all that summer, and I never saw my teacher again for 30 years, but I knew her as soon as I saw her, although she did not know me. She was then married to Mr. George C. Gibbs of Blandford. I bought a place in Blandford, and Mr. Gibbs gave me the warranty deed of it, he having a mortgage upon it. But to return to my school days, I went to school the following winter. My teacher then was Mr. F. W. Manley. He has since been depot agent at Washington for many years, Washington in Berkshire County, between Hinsdale and Beckett. I did not see him again for 18 or 20 years, but I knew him at first sight then, and I made myself known to him, and I think I stayed with him one night. The following spring I commenced going to school again, to a lady by the name of Sarah Ingalls, who then lived in the first house north of the Congregational Church in Lenox. I was now 6 years old, and I remember how odd it looked to me to see a lady chew tobacco, for she used the weed, and she also had a mattress in the closet, where small children like myself, and some others, were carefully stowed away when we got sleepy on those long summer days, and after a good nap we were permitted to go out and play, and then return to the schoolroom, to go through the tasks of saying our letters, reading, and so forth. I remember all the names of the scholars in the school, every summer and winter during all of my school days perfectly well today, as if it was only a week ago. The next summer I went to school, to the same man that I first went to, Mr. Manley, for he taught 2 winters. Nothing occurred during this winter of any importance, or at least not enough to take up space in my little sketch. The next summer I was 7 years old, and commenced to go to school to a lady by the name of Elizabeth Judd, daughter of Captain James Judd of Lenox, and a near neighbor to me in the same district. This was my last term of going to school in the summer, but I went winters, as I shall state hereafter, and my next winter's teacher was Mr. James Barrett, a resident of the same town and same district also. He taught 2 winters. The next teacher was Mr. George Fitch, who is now Deacon Fitch of the Congregational Church of Lenox. He taught 2 winters. The next, and my last teacher, was James Mattoon. But the spring that I was 8 years of age, I did not go to school. During that summer, I used to go over to Colonel Belden's, and scour the knives and the forks, and scour out the great old marble sink, and wash milk pans, and churn, and do such errands as a boy of that age generally gets enough of to make him wish he was a man, and had some boy to do the running for him. But when the winter came, and school commenced, I went to school again. And I was always steady at school, and I do not think I ever lost or missed a day up to this time of my schooling. I passed this winter a steady attendant, and the following spring, that brought me to 9 years of age, I went on errands, rode horse to plow, furrowed out, and got so I could drive a horse to the village, drive oxen to drag, spread hay, and do a great many useful turns about the colonel's place. And they used to get me to drive the horse for the young ladies to Pittsfield, Lenox, and Lee. The daughters of Colonel Belden were Miss Catherine and Eliza, whom I used to accompany as driver, and they used to set me copies in writing, hear me recite in geography, and arithmetic. I do not remember ever to have had received a penny in cash from either during my whole life. I mean the girls. There was another daughter, older, who was married, and her husband's name was Thomas E. Steele, but she was gone away before I commenced to do any work in the family. But she lived in Lee, Mass., where I used to go with the other two girls as driver, with the horse and an old-fashioned two-wheel carriage, several times in the course of the summer. Thus passed my life for some time. During the summer days working for the neighbors for what they chose to pay me for such work and services as I was able to render them, which was light work and errands mostly. But there is one thing I would state here. I was always looked upon as an honest and trustworthy boy by all who knew me, and so I was, and I do not remember ever to have done a wrong thing to any individual, nor to have made a misstatement in any case or form. There were other poor boys in the neighborhood besides me, but I was the one always chosen to be trusted by neighbors, where the others were refused. And I will furthermore state that I was never punished at school for any offense but once in my life, and I will relate what it was for, as I have plenty of time. During one of my terms of summer school, on Saturday afternoon, the teacher and some of the largest girls were cleaning the schoolhouse, as there was to be a meeting there at 5 o'clock on Sunday, and a boy by the name of Collins Brooks and I were carrying water from the spring to the schoolhouse for this purpose. There was a green frog in the spring, and we put him in the pail, and he kept to the bottom until the teacher put her scrub brush in the pail. When he rose to the top of the water and, of course, frightened her, she then inquired into the matter, and I told her that I put it in on purpose to scare her, and she made me stand in the middle of the schoolroom with my right hand raised over my head for 10 minutes. I am positive that was the only time I was ever punished for any offense in school. My time was spent during my summers until I was 12 years of age, working for the neighbors, sometimes a week at a time, and sometimes a month, in haying and harvest, so that I got able to do considerable work. Finally, when I was 12 years of age, Nancy Kelson hired me out for 6 months, for $3 per month, to work for a farmer by the name of James Williams, who lived in Lenox on East Street. I worked that summer, and in the fall went back to my old home to go to school, and in the spring that I was 13 years old, I hired out to Samuel Belden for 8 months, for $3.50 per month, and when my time was out, hired to him again for the winter, for $3 per month. He took a job of M.S. Wilson, cutting and drawing wood, and I worked in the woods all winter. In the spring, I came to Pittsfield to work for lawyer Thomas A. Gold. He lived on East Street, where lawyer Kellogg now lives, in a red brick house. Governor Briggs lived across the road at the time, and I became a favorite of the governor's. A nice man he was indeed. When I went to work for Mr. Thomas Augustus Gold, I was 14 years old that spring, and I was to have $5 per month for 8 months, and do chores for my board, and go to school in the winter. My work was light, only to take care of a horse and 1 cow, and go on errands and drive the carriage, wait on the table, etc., but never was I allowed to play with any of the boys in the street. If I had time to play, I had to invite some of the boys to Mr. Gold's backyard. I had one playfellow, almost always a colored boy, who lived with Governor Briggs. His name was George Briggs Elkey, and as I used to go to the governor's to carry milk sometimes, I got acquainted with him, and we became fast friends. I was pleased with my new place, and I soon was liked by every member of the family. And I was not allowed to work in the garden or field. The family consisted of Mr. Gold, his wife, a son, who was at home, then studying law with his father, and one daughter about my age, Miss Maria Gold. She taught me to play the piano, and I soon got to be quite an expert for one of my age and inexperience. Mr. Gold had also one son in New York, a merchant, and he had a sister, then an old maiden lady, whose name was Martha Gold. I believe if there are any angels in heaven, she is one of them now. She used to give me a lesson 3 times a week in the New Testament, and hear me read, instruct me, and give me good advice. Mr. Gold kept 2 hired girls, one by the name of Fanny, and the other Mary. The latter was a large Irish woman, about 40 years of age, both with red hair and a red face. Mr. Gold's people kept plenty of wine and brandy, and Mary the cook, generally known as Red Mary, carried the keys to the locked cellar. and she used to like a drop. I found it out, for she often sent me to a certain drugstore to get her a quart of liquor, but never sent any money for it. If this should reach the man's eyes, who kept the drugstore, he will remember Red Mary, if he does not remember me, although he has known me from my infancy up to 30 years of age. This getting rum for Red Mary at the drugstore was the means of my first glass, or first taste, of rum. She sweetened some in a goblet, put some nutmeg and warm water in it, and told me to drink it. I remember how I refused at first, but finally drank it all, and never have forgotten how it made me feel, because I have been reminded of it so often since, by the same kind of feeling. Oh, cursed be that first glass! I warn all young men and boys never to yield to such temptation, for I tell you of a truth, it has caused me worlds of trouble and sorrow. But do not think that I mean to say that rum got me into this trouble which confines me here today, for I do not allude to this as any trouble that I have in any way caused myself. God knows that I am innocent of the crime of murder. Thanks be to God that I am. But I sit in a cell in the Berkshire County prison, awaiting trial for murder, and that is the reason why I am writing these words, to pass away the time. I think the most pleasant summer of my life was this summer, when I was 14 years of age, and lived with Mr. Gold. In July, I used to drive him to Lenox to attend court, and if it was raining, I used to stay all day and put the horses in M.P. Wilson's stable. Wilson kept the hotel, which William O. Curtis now keeps. I had all the day to myself on such occasions, but if it was not a rainy day, I used to drive down with him in the morning and return alone, and go after him at night, so I had 2 trips on pleasant days and 1 on rainy days. But I had no choice in the weather. I liked to stay down there, and I liked to ride, and when my time was out, it had been so easy, I thought I would go to some place where I could have more to do, and learn to work on a farm, and I done so. I went home. In the winter I went to school, which was my last schooling, but I had opportunities to go back to Mr. Gould's for years after, and I've never worked in a place yet but I could go and work again if they wanted a man. I have stated previously that Mr. Gould's son, who was at home, was studying law with his father, but he was practicing at the bar at the time. He had graduated. I think he was educated at Williamstown. At all events, he was of no benefit to me, as I had to drive him and go fishing and hunting with him. He always carried a bottle of brandy, of course, and I had to come in for a share. Nancy Kelson had always taught me never to drink, and it was this that made me first think of leaving my place. I remember that I did not sleep much the night before. I told Mr. Gold that I was going away, but in the morning I told him, and told him not only one of my reasons, but all of them. He told me that I'd better stay, but he could not persuade me to. He said, "John, you are an honest, true chap, and if you are ever in want of assistance, do not be afraid to call on me for anything I can do for you. I would do cheerfully, and it would be a great pleasure." I went to school in the winter, that I was 14 years of age, and it was my last school term. And the spring that I was 15, I went to work for Samuel Belden again, at $6 a month. And the next winter I worked for him also, chopping wood, by the month, so that I was a year there this time. In the spring, that I was 16 years of age, I hired out to Deacon Charles Mattoon to work on a farm. He hired me out to work for a man that he had let his farm to. The man's name was Elijah Mason. I lived in the same house with the deacon. The farm was situated in North Lenox, in the same district where I was born. I was to have $8 per month, and the deacon was to pay me. Mason was a great worker, and a hard drinker besides, and I also got into quite a habit of drinking that summer myself. And to tell the truth, the deacon had a little himself. I used to like to see him when he had got a little down. He was so good and jovial at such times, and I have driven his horse to Pittsfield, in the evening, to get a little whiskey, after I had done a hard day's work. But I do not think I ever told anyone of it until now, as the deacon told me to keep mum about it. I was now 16 years of age, the 23rd of March. and I went to work for Charles Mattoon on the 1st day of April, and my time was out the 1st day of October. I got married on the 9th of October, and I was not 17 until the next March. I married a girl named Rebecca Robinson, who was born in Pittsfield, and was brought up by the Reverend Hubbard Beebe in Longmeadow, and I think he was a native of this place. After we were married, I went to Washington in this county, and worked with a man who married my wife's aunt. We both went to work there, her aunt being sick at the time. My wife did the housework, and I worked in the woods with her uncle. His name was Henry Nash, and he had taken a job of Mr. Thaddeus Lyman, and so he hired me to help him. I worked that winter hard, both early and late, and all I got for my winter's work was 50 cents in my board. Rather rough, but such is life, I thought. This spring, I was 17 years of age, and my wife was 20. I hired out the 1st day of April to Deacon George Fitch. He had been one of my old school teachers. He was not deacon at the time I worked for him, and I hope he is a better man now than he was at the time, for I shall never forget how he served me about my pay. It matters not now, but certainly he did not deal honestly with me, by a long shot, nor pay me either as he agreed to. I hope these lines may reach him before he dies, for he cannot help but remember how he used me. My wife hired out at the same time to Solomon Cole Esquire of North Lenox, so that we were not more than 60 rods from each other. But I finally left George Fitch, and went back to Samuel Belden's again, and stayed until fall, and then went to keeping house at the very same place I was born, and my first child was born there that spring. I went to work for Walter Richards in the spring, by the month, and stayed at home nights, as it was only 1/2 mile from home. Our first child was a boy, and lived until it was 5 months old, and then died with the whooping cough. It was born where I was born, at Nancy Kelson's house. Hereafter I shall not attempt to keep dates, but merely give a general statement as they come in, and simply give the names of the different people that I have worked for, and the different towns, etc. I worked for Mr. Richards through that summer, and the following winter I went to work for my wife's uncle in Lanesboro. We cut wood for Mr. John Partridge. In that summer we broke up housekeeping, and my wife went to work for Dr. Oliver E. Brewster of Pittsfield, and I went to work for Samuel Belden again. And in the fall or winter I moved to Peru, and took a job there of cutting logs for Johnson Stebbins, and lost my winter's work, as Stebbins moved out west and left his debts unpaid, I being one of the unpaid victims. Finally, we had another child born, a girl. It was born in Peru. And then I moved to Beckett, and went to work for Charles Cozier, and then back to Pittsfield, where our baby died. If trouble is a blessing, I have been thrice blessed. After this, we went to Lanesboro again. I, always following my wife's advice, we moved into the house with her uncle, and he and I went to work for Mr. Frank Brodie upon a farm. He also burnt lime, and had a lime kiln. We stayed there until Dr. Brewster came, and wanted my wife to go work for him again. And, of course, I gave her her choice, and she went. The result was I had to break up housekeeping, as I boarded at home, although I had planted 2 acres of corn, had a good pig, and also a good garden. I sold these for what I could get, and came to Pittsfield, and went to work for the Shakers, with another of my wife's uncles, William Hamilton. I was clear discouraged, and tired of my wife's management of affairs. Then we had another baby born, a white one this time, and that put a damper on me. But it died in infancy, and we broke up housekeeping for life, as things turned out. Now I resolved that I would let her take care of herself, and all the white babies she had a mind to have. And so we parted, and I have never seen her but once since. She got a bill from me, then she had 2 more children, and finally got married again. And I have not seen her in 24 years. I do not know whether she is dead or alive. I next went into the barber business for a while, and afterwards went to Troy, into a cabinet shop, and learned wood carving with Mr. Lyman Munson. I am a No. 1 workman at the business, but it hurt my stomach to work at a bench, and I had to quit at last. Then I came back to Pittsfield, and went down to Lenox and worked a while for Mr. Walter Richards. From there, went to Mr. Samuel Belden's again. So you will see that I have spent a good part of my young days in the Belden family, at one time or another. From there, I came back to Pittsfield, and went to work for Augustus Robbins, in the west part of the town. Then I went back to Walter Richards again. I next went to work for Marshall Hubbard, in the west part of Pittsfield. He charged me $8 for being absent 8 Sunday evenings from my chores, and I was only getting $16 per month. He owed me $39 when my time was out, and I took up $29, and took his note for $10 payable to me, or bearer. The note was given by figures, instead of wording the amount, and I took this opportunity to get back my $8, which he had cheated me out of. I changed the note from 10 to 110, just made one straight mark, and sold the note for the last figures. But that was the dearest straight mark I have ever made. The result was I was arrested for forgery and acquitted. But I told the court that I changed, or put the figure 1 to the note, and I was sentenced on the spot to 3 years' hard labor in the House of Correction at Lenox, though I paid back the money before I received the sentence. I should state, and take a solemn oath before God, that in all of the different times that I have been punished for simple offenses against the law, I was never guilty of any of them except the one that I have just mentioned. I was once put in jail for stealing a bag of meal, and the man swore that the meal was stolen in the month of May, and that he thought I took it. Now, I was in prison at the time it was stolen, but I was about half drunk at the trial, and did not make any defense, and I was sent to prison for 6 months. Deacon Booth of Hinsdale discovered the fraud and false imprisonment, and got up a petition signed by all of the best men in Hinsdale, including the selectmen of the town. But the lawyer to whom the business was entrusted was so slow about it that I was only 2 weeks to stay when he got ready to go to the governor with a petition. So I made up my mind to stay out my time and try to get pay for false imprisonment. But I had no money, and so let it all pass by. But the folks in Hinsdale have never forgotten, nor never will, I hope. Meal in May, when I was in prison under 3-year sentence at the time, and did not come out until July after. But the law then did not allow prisoners to swear for themselves as it does now. I am stating these facts to show how a man who is poor may be made to suffer through the spite of officers of the law. Mr. Phineas Cone of this town can testify these facts, for he was juror at the time, but he never thought of the fraud until Deacon Booth had ascertained the facts and got up the petition for my release. Oh, when I think of some part of my past, it makes my blood run cold, to see what I have suffered without just cause. But this affair is a known fact in the town of Hinsdale, and also other places. After this I went to Peru to work for Mr. Frank Frissell, a farmer, and worked 6 months. Just before my time was out, he was taken sick, and I stayed after my time was out until he died, which was, I think, about a month, and then I went to work for a man in Windsor, Mr. Nelson Watkins, chopping cordwood. I boarded with Mr. Ullman T. Pierce, one of the finest farmers, and also one of the finest men of the town. The wood that I cut was on his farm, but was sold to Mr. Watkins. I stayed there and chopped all winter, and spent one of the most enjoyable winters of my life. Mr. Watkins was a good paymaster. I had $1 per cord for chopping the wood, and he paid cash every Saturday night, and I had very good health and good board. I was an A No. 1 chopper, and earned good wages. I worked hard, early and late, and earned on average $2 per day, and I was steady at my work. Mr. Pierce's family, I think, was the best family I've ever lived with. Mr. Pierce had 8 children, and they were the best family of children in the county. The spring following I went to work for Mr. O.K. Dennis. He lived in the east part of the town of Hinsdale. He was a good whitewasher, and also a good paper hanger, and he took me in as a partner, and we commenced our work in the month of March, in the town of Hinsdale, for Mr. Plunkett. We first took the job of whitewashing all of his mills, and we whitewashed all of the mills in the town of Hinsdale, and about all of the mill tenements, and 3/5 of all the dwellings in the village, and hung over 400 rolls of paper in Hinsdale and Dalton. We made good wages and drank good liquor, the best we could get. We finished up in Hinsdale and Dalton and went to Lee, where Dennis, my partner, was held high in the art as a professional paper hanger, whitewasher, etc. We first commenced work in Lee for Prentice Seabeard on his paper mills in East Lee. We boarded at the hotel kept by Mr. Norman Strickland, and we earned wages that furnished us admittance into good society, as we called it, but such as I have since made up my mind was both unprofitable and not wholly proper or strictly up to the point of morality. Still, we wronged no one but ourselves, though we abused the talents God had given us for better purpose and better use. We worked in Lee until the last week in June, when I went to work in Peru to peel bark for Selden Blackman, and I lived in a shanty with another black man, and we cooked our own food and boarded ourselves for 3 weeks. And as I had money and the other man had none, of course I had to cash up for all the food, as Blackman was not to pay us until our job was done. We finished the job according to contract, but I never got a penny for my work, and never would sue Blackman for it. After I got through there, I went to work haying for Sylvester B. French of Peru, and after he was through, I went to Mr. Dwight Frissell's and worked until late in the fall, and then I went to work again for Nelson Watkins, and boarded at the same place as before, Almond T. Pierce's in Windsor, and chopped the same as I did the winter before. And as 2 of his sons had gone to war, Mr. Pierce hired me by the month for 7 months. It was a good place, and I dare say he will give me the name of being a good worker on a farm. After I got through there I went to Ashfield, and went to chopping by the cord for Mr. Enos Hall. I boarded with a man named John Delaney all winter, and in the spring I went to North Blandford and hired out to Mr. Joseph A. Gibbs for 8 months at $26 per month. He was a farmer, and built a large barn that summer, and in the fall I laid all the stable floors and made all the mangers nights. I did work enough nights, after my day's work was done, to pay for a fat cow and 10 bushels of potatoes, and I got a woman to keep house for me, and went to housekeeping in the fall after my time was out. I cut cordwood for Mr. Gibbs in the winter, and in the spring I hired a house of Patrick Nooney, and worked around by the job, chopping, for W.P. Knox in the spring and peeling bark, and then I worked for him and others in haying and harvest. I laid a piece of wall for Samuel A. Bartholomew, Esquire, and worked for him until winter. That winter there was the most snow that I have ever known in any winter in my life, but it was a good one for work, and the wages were good, and money was plenty with me, for I was always industrious. In the early part of the winter I moved to Becket, about 4 miles from where I had been living at the time. The man that I went to work for in Becket was Mr. C.O. Perkins, a man who is well known as one of the most successful and the greatest experimental farmer in this county, as can be seen by the printed agricultural reports. I hired out to him to drive a team, and I was also to break some colts for him during the winter, which I did with good success. I lived in a tenant house belonging to Mr. Perkins, and I kept a horse and the colts in the barn at the place where I lived. I worked for him all winter, and in the spring I hired a farm of him, the farm in Becket known as Cone Farm, adjoining Mr. George Huntington's farm, and I was to pay $6 a year, besides the taxes also. I was to have the right to cut wood upon the farm, in the winter to pay the rent, and I was to have $1.25 per cord for cutting the wood. But I got along so fast cutting the wood that he would not pay me but $1 per cord, although it was stated in my lease that I should have $1.25, and his excuse was that I was earning too large wages, and that if every poor man in the county should be dealt by in the same way, the whole world would soon be ruined by letting the poor people take advantage of the farmers. These were Mr. C.O. Perkins' pious statements in regards to the poor, helpless laborer in the Christian town of Becket. I stayed on the farm and did my work in summer, cut my hay early, and before other farmers had half of their haying done, I was all through and ready to go out haying for others. I went to work for my nearest neighbor, Mr. George H. Huntington, and helped him through his haying and harvesting. He was a neat, good farmer, and a nice man in every respect. After I had got through with him, and when I had got my fall's work done, I went to work for C.O. Perkins laying wall. The wall across the road from his house I laid from the schoolhouse south of his house to the foot of the hill north of where he lives, for $1.10 per rod. It is the best street fence in the town of Becket, and, no doubt, many who see it will remember seeing me at that time. And none will look upon me who knew me then, or anyone whom I have ever worked for, as a murderer, or an ugly, bad man. For I was always liked, wherever I worked, and have always been noted for my quiet and mild temper, and for my particularly good example before children. Now some people may think I am guilty of this charge which is laid upon me, and that I am writing this sketch fearing that I may be convicted. But never have I possessed such a thought for a moment. And I protest before God and man that I am an innocent man. And furthermore, this will not come before the public until after I am tried. But I simply want the public to know that I am not as bad a man as the papers have represented me to be. But to return to my places of labor. After I got through on the Perkins farm, I went to North Blandford, about 4 miles east of Mr. Perkins, and bought a small place of Zealot's Miller, and I received a warranty deed of Mr. George C. Gibbs. I went to work for the neighbors by the day or by the job, and in fact, any way to get an honest living, and I have the best record as a laborer, at any kind of farm work, of any man that lived in the town at the time. I once cut in the woods for Mr. Gibbs, and he held a watch while I cut and split 1/2 cord of beechwood out of one tree. I cut the tree into 3-foot wood in 11 minutes, and split it up in 17 minutes, making 28 minutes cutting from one tree 1/2 cord of wood, and splitting it up. Mr. Gibbs piled it as soon as I was through, and measured it. I also mowed 10 acres of grass for David Hamilton, the same summer, in 3 1/2 days, at $1 per acre and my board, and it was estimated that there were 13 tons of hay in the 10 acres. If anyone doubts these statements, let them write to the men. They are good and reliable persons. In my young days, I learned to work at the Colonel Belden farm in Lenox, for the Beldens were great farmers, and I early formed the notion that I would have a farm of my own sometime, and I made up my mind that if I did not do that, I would always work for good farmers, if I worked for any. So I never yet have worked for any but good men, and men of good standing, unless I went into a strange place and got deceived. These facts can be plainly seen by the names of the men whom I have mentioned. The summer that I have last spoken of, I worked for a great many different men, jobbing and by the day. I labored some for Abel Peckman, Jr. He was a dairy farmer and my nearest neighbor, and could have worked at his place always, as he told me he would give me work any day I did not have it at another place. And I found him one of the best neighbors. I hope I have returned as many kindnesses to me, at any rate. I always tried to do so, and think I always gave him good satisfaction. The woman I was living with at this time was the same one that first kept house for me in the fall after I got through work for Joseph A. Gibbs. She also lived with me as my wife when I hired the farm of Mr. Perkins in Becket, but at this time we were in Blandford, and in the month of July she bore me a child, a girl, and there was quite a talk about the unexpected affair, but folks did not take the trouble to ask if I was or was not married, for the people of Blandford are not so disposed to so much popular meanness as they are in the county of Berkshire, and I never have lived in any place that could match Berkshire for injustice and oppression of the poor. I've always kept posted through the papers of the county and the state, and I've traveled one winter, and sold essence, and I conversed with the poor in the almshouses in this county and others. And I'm sorry to say that old Berkshire, my birthplace, makes the most limited provisions of any that has ever come under my observation, and I have in my possession the statement of some town paupers, whom I have had interviews with, which will show that these statements are correct. In the fall, after people had got through their fall work, I took a job of chopping, and got 2 men to chop for me. I took the job of Mr. James Lemon, one of my nearest neighbors, to cut off a wood lot about 1 mile from my house. I boarded the 2 men, and I made a good thing of it that winter. I got all through by the last of February, 1 month sooner than I had agreed to have it done. And then I took another job of Mr. Charles Smith, another neighbor, which lasted me until the 1st of April. I am simply giving the names of these men to show how good my memory is, and to show that I was always at work, as all of these men will well remember and assert. And I do not remember that I ever worked for a man who ever refused to let me have a horse or an ox team if I wanted one, for I have been noted both for being a good teamster and one of the best hands to take care of stock in the county or state. The next spring I hired out by the month, for 6 months, to a near neighbor, Mr. Abel Peckham, and I worked from the 1st of April until the middle of July, when sickness prevented my working longer, and he had to hire another man. But when I got so I could work again, I went to work for him by the day, and also worked for another in the neighborhood. I will here give the names of the men, so as to give an opportunity for any inquiries about these statements, if the reader of these lines feels disposed to make any, that they may know that they are all true, and I certainly have no object in making any false statements. I worked some for Captain Ellie, and also Mr. Freegrace Norton, and for Luther Clark, Enoch Burdick, Frank Mann, William Knox, also for Colonel Simeon Lauren, by the day and job. I have worked for all of these men, more or less, off and on, and others in the town of Blandford, and my reputation is good there, God knows, and I also bear a good moral record in this community. In no town or county have I ever had a fight with a man in my life. I worked around for these different men until late in the fall, when I hired out to drive team for James Lemon and draw wood. I stayed until spring, when I hired out to Deacon William E. Hinsdale for 1 year, and commenced on the 1st of April. I worked until the month of August, when sickness prevented my keeping on. One of those affairs happened which is so common among the poorer classes, and especially with colored people. My housekeeper brought forth again, and had a boy this time, and both the boy and the girl are now living, and are with their grandmother in Blandford, who lives on the same place that I previously mentioned in this sketch, which I bought off of Mr. Zealot's Miller. They are all the children that I have, and they have a good home, thanks be to God. As I could not go to Deacon Hinsdale's again, I took a job nearer home, of digging and stoning a cellar, and after I got it finished, I laid a piece of wall for Mr. Philo Knox. When winter came, I worked for anyone that wanted me, and continued to do so until the spring opened, when I had a good run of work, as usual, and good wages, and good paymasters in Blandford. I went to work for Colonel Simeon Lauren, peeling bark, and I stayed until haying, when I was employed by Frank Tiffany. In August, my housekeeper went away with another man, and I got her mother to take care of the children, and she and her husband moved into my house, and they are now living there. In the fall, I went to Otis, and worked until early in the winter, when I went to Pleasant Valley, Connecticut, and there worked for Mr. John R. Benjamin. I cut and got out timber for 5 depots on the Connecticut Western Railway during the winter. In the spring, I came to Monterey and was engaged by Mr. M.S. Bidwell, and I stayed with him until haying time, when I went to Mr. Lemuel J. Townsend's, and worked for him until he had got through haying. After that, I went to Mr. W. H. Minor's, and when I got through with him, I went to Canton, Connecticut, and got married. Then I went to North Colebrook, and worked for Clement Thompson, laying wall, until winter, when I took a job of chopping wood for Mr. Augustine Hamilton, and worked all winter. I then, in the spring, hired a place of Mrs. Laura E. Roberts, and moved in on the 1st of April, and worked around by the day until the ground got settled. When the ground was quite settled, I hired out to the agent of the Cannon Iron Companies to work on a coal job near where I lived. I was to have $50 a month and oversee 8 men, and the leveling and making the pit bottoms, setting the pits and getting them ready to burn, and to keep the time of the other men. They were all Frenchmen, and only 2 could talk English at all, so I had a hard task, for I did not understand a word of French when I went there. But I soon learned of the 2 that could talk English, so that in 1 month's time I could make them understand them, so far as the work was concerned, and I got along nicely. I never had a word of difficulty with any of the men, and I kept the time, and I believe I gave good satisfaction to both parties, for the company made me a present of a barrel of flour when I settled up in the fall. And they also offered me work for the next summer, if I wanted it, but I was destined to have a bad job, as it happened the next spring. After I'd got through with the coal job, I took a job of chopping, but the man backed out on account of not being able to pay me as he agreed, so I was left without work in the beginning of winter. At last there came a very deep snow, so I went around and got some ox sleds and horse sleds to make, and 1 buggy box. I also made a quantity of bows and axe helves, and in fact I did most anything to get an honest living. In March I cut a good many cords of stove wood for the Thompsons and Priest Russell of North Colebrook, and I sawed up Mr. J. S. Whalen's woodpile, so that with my good wages the summer before, and what I had earned during the winter, I had some money, and I looked for a chance to get a money-making job for the summer. I spent about a week looking around, though I believe I never spent a day in my life before looking for work, as I was always sure to have a job ready to commence as soon as I had one finished. I was always at work, and never in my life spent more than 1 day in the year at any of the county or town fairs, or any place of amusement whatever. And for the last 9 years, I've only been to 1 cattle show and 1 horse race. My habits for the last 15 years have been steady and industrious, up to the time that I was arrested, the 30th of November, 1877. After I'd looked around, for about a week I took a job in New Marlborough to draw coal at 75 cents per 100 bushels, and he was to furnish the team and feed it. I was to build the road to the coal bush, and to the bush about 1 mile, and he was to furnish me a house and a garden spot, and my firewood. I moved the 8th of April, and I went to work with a will to conquer and to prosper, if working early and late would do it. I hired a man to help me to build the road, and I boarded him and my wife, and we worked about 5 weeks and finished the road. Then I drew rails and built a strong fence around a good spot for a garden, and planted it. I planted 1/2 acre to potatoes, and I was to have half of the crop. I then went to drawing coal, and I drew 1,400 bushels in 3 days. I only had to draw it 1 mile. What I mean to have the reader understand is, I was to have 75 cents per 100 bushels for drawing the coal, but I was to build the road in the bargain, and consider that 75 cents would pay me for building the road and drawing the coal. That is, I was to make the road myself. Well, after I had got my roads all done, and the garden and potatoes nicely planted, Mr. H. came and took the wagon off, and took them home to draw with. I went over to see him about it, and said he, "I want to use them 2 or 3 days, and I will send them back again." It was in the bargain that I should have the wagons after I began to draw the coal, all of the time during the summer, without any interruptions or disappointments from him of any kind. But I said nothing, and waited 5 days. When I went over again to see him, I could not get them. I told him I didn't want to be idle, and that he was not doing according to the agreement by me. And he replied that I had earned $3.50 per day since I began to draw, and I could afford to lie still a few days. Finally, I took a stone sluice to build for the town, and then after I finished, I went to see him again, and he told me he had made up his mind not to have me draw any more, for I had made a good road, and he thought he could draw the coal with his horse teams, and that I might go home and turn the oxen out to pasture. The house where I lived was 6 miles from any village, and 3 miles around the road to the nearest neighbor. I was in the wilderness almost, and not one day's work to be had for miles around. I had my garden and potato fields, but I had not a penny for the work that I had done for H. Finally, on Saturday, I went to Norfolk, Connecticut, to buy a few articles at the store, as that was the nearest place where there were any stores kept. I finished my trading, and was on my way home again, when I met a man on the way, who inquired of me where I lived and what I worked at. I told him that I had no work just then, and stated how I had been disappointed. And after I finished my story, he asked me if I would come and mow for him a few days, and I told him I would help him the next week for $2 per day and board, and he told me to come on Monday. This was on Saturday, and I went back to the store and bought me a scythe and a snath, and left them at his house. And on Monday, I was there bright and early to go to work. The man's name was Mr. E.T. Butler, of Norfolk, Connecticut, and I worked for him for 6 days that week, and on Saturday night he paid me $12. That same time, Mr. Butler told me that if I would help him through haying, he would pay me $2.25 a day and board me. I told him that I would, so I worked for him for about 4 weeks. During this time he engaged me to come and work for him a month in September. I agreed to go any time he called after the middle of August. I went away then and worked at haying for Dr. Stevens, and when I got through I helped Mr. Lawrence a few days, and then laid a wall for Mr. Austin Spaulding, until Mr. Butler called for me to come and work the month that he had hired me for. I worked my month out for him, and when I had got through he hired me for 1 year, and I was to live in his tenant house across the road from him. I went home to dig my potatoes, which I had planted upon share on H's land, the man I took the coal job of, and I was to have half of the potatoes. But when I got home, he had been there and dug about 3/4 of the crop and carried them away, and turned his cattle out on the lot, and they had trampled and damaged what was left for me a good deal. But I said not one word, for it is not my disposition to have any trouble with anyone, although I was advised by the neighbors to sue him, and most all of them, and 2 or 3 rich men, told me if I would sue him they would help me get justice, and see that I had my rights. But I thought best not to have any trouble, and I let it all go. I dug what was left of the potatoes and harvested my garden, and I had as good a crop of garden sauce as any poor man. But it hurt me to think of my potatoes. I moved to Mr. Butler's in Norfolk, and went to work for him a year. And my wife had plenty of work there, as Mr. Butler kept between 40 and 50 city boarders in the summer. My wife had $1 a day for the washing and ironing and her board. Mr. Butler was a farmer also, and kept and milked 16 cows in the summer when the price of milk was low, and 25 in the winter when it was high, and it was my business to do the farm and garden work, milk the cows, take the milk to the railroad station. You may be sure that it was not my business to sleep in the daylight any time in the year. I remember in the month of March I did my chores, milked 23 cows twice a day, and took care of a pair of oxen and a pair of horses. Dear listener, at this point, Ten Eyck tells again the story of working for O.K. Dennis, whitewashing and hanging wallpaper. I'm not sure what his situation was in jail, whether he was mailing these pages ahead as he wrote them and did not have access to the stories he had already written and forgot that he'd already told this one, or perhaps he was just so flustered by the stress of it all he didn't think to look back. But I will read it, just as it is written, a copy almost word for word of what he said before. So I continue. I forgot to mention that I went to work for Mr. O. K. Dennis. He lived in the east part of the town of Hinsdale. He was a good whitewasher, and also a good paper hanger, and he took me in as a partner, and we commenced our first work in the month of March in the town of Hinsdale. For Mr. Plunkett, we took a job of whitewashing all of his mills, and we whitewashed all of the mills in the town of Hinsdale, and about all of the mill tenements, and 3/5 of all the dwellings in the village, and hung over 400 rolls of paper in Hinsdale and Dalton. We made good wages and drank good liquor, the best we could get. We finished up in Hinsdale and Dalton, and went to Lee, where Dennis, my partner, was held high in his art as a professional paper hanger, whitewasher, etc. We first commenced work in Lee for Prentice C. Beard on his paper mills in East Lee. We boarded at the hotel kept by Mr. Norman Strickland, and we earned wages that furnished us admittance into good society, as we called it, but such as I have made up my mind was both unprofitable and not wholly proper, or strictly up to the point of morality. Still, we wronged no one but ourselves, although we abused the talents God had given us for better purpose and better use. I was chopping for Mr. John Shores one week, when the man I had hired gave Mr. Norton a whipping and was arrested, and I was also arrested with him, charged as an accomplice, but was cleared on Norton's testimony. Then we were tried for defiling Norton's well, and I got 6 months in the House of Correction, and the other man got 18 months. The other man did the deed, and afterwards made a boast of it, and said I had no hand in it, and neither did I. When my time was out in prison, I went to work for William Cooper, getting out rail ties, and then I cut wood for Eugene Clark, also sawed some wood for William Higgins of Lenox. Then I went to Sheffield, and the first day's work I ever did in Sheffield was for James Rohrbach in March of 1877. I went there a perfect stranger, and after I had cut him 6 cords of wood, I drove a team a few days for him, and then cut up his woodpile. I worked for him, and for the Littles, and the last work I did was for Dwight Boardman. I probably did more work than any colored man in the town, and I have been told so by men whom I have worked for. I do not feel conscious of doing a wrong thing to any person in Sheffield, although I am in prison, charged with murder. If this should ever happen to be read by the guilty person or persons, I hope and pray to God that they cannot eat nor sleep until they confess their guilt and show that I am innocent. God grant it may be so, is my prayer. And that's the end of The Life of John Ten Eyck, written by himself. After this episode and the last, what do you think? Unfortunately, there's probably no way to know now what the truth is. Was he a murderer? Or was he just an easy target? This has been The Berkshires Gone By. Created, written, directed, and read by myself, Brooke Grenier, and co-produced by Deanna Garner. You can follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, where I try to post a new picture pertaining to Berkshire history almost every day. You can also find more episodes on Facebook, YouTube, and at our website, www.theberkshiresgoneby.com, where each story is accompanied by specific photos related to that topic. We hope you'll join us for our next episode. Thanks for listening.